Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending this event sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Stella Lawrence, and we're here tonight with David A. Andelman. Andelman has traveled through and reported from 86 countries during his distinguished career. He has served as editor and publisher of World Policy Journal, an executive editor of Forbes, a domestic and foreign correspondent for the New York Times, the Southeast Asia Bureau Chief based in Bangkok, and the East European Bureau Chief based in Belgrade. He also worked as the Paris correspondent for CBS News and then as a Washington correspondent for CNBC. He was also the news editor of Bloomberg News and business editor of the New York Daily News. He is the author of 5 books and is currently executive director of the Red Lines Project, a Voices columnist for CNN Opinion, and the author of the Substack page, Andelman Unleashed. We're going to have a lot to talk about. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the very beginning. How did you get into journalism? How did you kick off this distinguished career of yours?
Well, let's see. In high school, actually at Newton South High, I had this yen for being a journalist. I thought my real specialty in those days was physics and math. I was a great science scholar, experimenter, and whatever. It turned out that was not a good fit by the time I got to college, but I didn't know that at the time. At any rate, I still thought it would be interesting to do journalism in high school. The problem was, at the school newspaper, you had to take the journalism course in order to be allowed to work for the newspaper. And I did not have enough electives left. I was taking 2 languages, French and Russian, English, history, and so on. But they still would not let me work for the local newspaper, for the high school newspaper. So it wasn't until I got to college, to Harvard, that I really realized that I should be doing real journalism. I went off for the Crimson. But I got really excited about WHRB, the Harvard Radio Broadcasting, the Harvard radio station. And that's where I really began to make my mark. Within the first year, I became news director, and I decided that was what my field was going to be. I majored in history, as it turned out. Physics did not particularly suit me, shall we say. In fact, my physics teacher said he'd pass me only if I agreed never to set foot in a physics lab again, because he was afraid that somehow I managed to blow up the world. But so that was pretty clear. At the same time, I've always been interested in foreign affairs. When I was a young teenager, my parents brought me my first Zenith transoceanic radio, and I would listen to Radio Moscow and Radio Beijing and Radio Peking in those days, and the BBC and so on. So it was clear after I was out of school, I was going to be a journalist. I went to Columbia Journalism School. And then I went to work in local radio and television out on the West Coast. It was an interesting experience. It was a learning experience. I started in Seattle, Washington, for the NBC station as the radio reporter for I used to do the morning drive time show for the Frosty Fowler show and I was the news guy. From there, I went to Sacramento. I went to work for the CBS station in Sacramento, KXTV. As a producer, not on the air. I still did not get on the air. The news director was a very interesting fellow named Tom Capra, who totally inspired me. He was Frank Capra's son, and really an extraordinary news person. He later wound up as Barbara Walters' producer during Watergate. He became executive producer of the Today Show for a while, and he gave me my first real taste of what it was like to do big boy journalism. That ended. I decided I did not want to stay on the West Coast for very much longer. I was an East Coast guy. Came back to New York, and Newsday was hiring. Bill Moyers had just become publisher of Newsday. So he hired me as a night beat reporter. And I covered school boards and local village boards and so on the North Shore of Long Island. They eventually moved me to Dayside. I became an education writer. I covered the courts in Mineola, which is where I met the New York Times Long Island reporter, Roy Silver. Roy, as it turned out, lived right next door to the assistant foreign editor of the Times. And one day we were chatting and I said, you know, Ray, what I really want to do was I want to go overseas, and I want to go overseas for the Times. He said, it just happens that I know this guy. Comes back the next day and he says, call Seymour Topping, who was then the foreign editor of the New York Times. He's looking for a news assistant. It's an internship program. It's been 1 year working for him. You go on the Times staff as a reporter, and a year after that, you'll go overseas. Wow. Okay. So I called Topping up, came in, we had an interview. 3 weeks later, I was working at the Times. That was December 23, 1968, a long time ago. I worked for him for a year, and as a news assistant on the foreign desk. Then sure enough, I went onto the Metro staff. I was in night rewrite, 7:30 at night till 3 in the morning, doing page one stories very often. Eventually, within a month or so, I had my first byline in the Times. Wound up going out to Long Island as correspondent, to Albany. In fact, the Metro editor, who knew I wanted to go overseas, said, he said, think of Long Island as your first foreign assignment, because at the tip of Montauk, it's about as far as you can get in the United States, and the next step is Europe. So, okay, fair enough. And those various things happened, and finally the Times wound up sending me to Saigon as bureau chief. After putting me through 4 months of total immersion Vietnamese training at Berlitz with a private tutor, I went over to Asia. So anyway, that's basically the long story about how I became a foreign correspondent.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I want to start with, you mentioned that already in high school you were taking 2 languages, and that's part of why you couldn't work for your high school newspaper. Was that a choice you made because you had some kind of foresight that you wanted to eventually work abroad, or was that just you were interested in that at the time?
Oh, no. I was very, well, both. I was
Okay.
very interested in languages. I loved France. Russia, I thought was fascinating. I've always been fascinated by Russia. This, of course, was Soviet Russia. In fact, it was the second place I went. The first place I went was a trip to England and France for 10 days. My second trip was to Russia, and I traveled all through Russia from what was then Leningrad to Moscow, down to Kiev, actually, which was then part of the Soviet Union. There was no doubt in my mind that I wanted to do something overseas, whether it was with science or with journalism or what have you. So I took those languages. I was pretty good in languages, actually, in those days. It gets to be harder and harder to learn a new language the older you get, by the way. So keep that in mind. But I was always been fascinated by it. Russian, I kind of let slide. I mean, I can read enough Russian to puzzle out a Russian newspaper and know it's something that I really should know more about. If I hear something on Russian language on the air, I can know it's a story that I should know more about and get someone to translate it for me. I would not feel comfortable writing a news story based on something I heard or a conversation I'd had in Russian. It's just not good enough.
Gotcha.
French, I'm pretty much fluent. I'm not bilingual. I have an accent. My son, who grew up in France, he is bilingual. He has no accent in either language. And the same with my grandson, who's now 10 years old. And he is the same position that my son is. So, that's basically the language story.
Okay. It's still very impressive. You also mentioned you were hired by Seymour Topping 2 days before Christmas, and that was kind of the path that set you. Long Island is the first foreign assignment. I like that. That's funny. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like to work from him and what you learned during your time under him?
Well, Topping was really my great mentor throughout my entire career and friend. In fact, his widow, he just died a couple of years ago. He was 99 when he passed away. He had an extraordinary life. I mean, he started his career working for the Associated Press in China. He was with Mao on the Long March, and he knew Mao personally. He really had an extraordinary career, and then he became foreign editor. What I really found extraordinary was working for him immediately. I began to understand the power and the reach of the New York Times. Now, I'll give you one small anecdote about that. Topping wanted me occasionally to do a story for the foreign desk. So he assigned me a story one day that had something to do with the Middle East. I think it might have been about some of these groups in New York that were agitating for more of a tilt towards the Palestinians. And so at any rate, I'd done this whole story, and he said, you need to get the State Department's perspective on this. He said, call up Joe Sisko and ask him. Well, now, Joseph Sisko in those days was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. He was a huge figure, really a towering figure, more so than any Assistant Secretary of State today. I mean, he was very close. He'd been very close to Kennedy, very close to Lyndon Johnson. These were the Johnson years. So I said, all right. So I rang up his office and I explained who I was, New York Times. And if I had done that at Newsday, I would have gotten a call back from some, junior PR person there who would have, given me a short statement. Within 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, I pick up my phone and he said, "Hi, it's Joe Cisco. What can I do for you?"
Wow.
That said more to me than anything else about the power and the glory of the New York Times. The Secretary of State I could have gotten on the phone in those days. It was extraordinary. So that was that kind of an understanding of the responsibility also that you have. Abe Rosenthal was interesting. He kept me from going overseas for several years after I joined the paper. Although Topping had wanted to get me over right away, he wanted more young people, young blood, young perspectives overseas. But Abe Rosenthal said, "Look, until you're 30 years old, you haven't made all your mistakes. If you make a mistake in New York, the worst thing that can happen is, the subway stop running for 8 hours. Overseas, he said, you could start a war." So I didn't go overseas until I was 30. As soon as I just turned 29. By the age of 30, I was on my way to Saigon. So that was very important. It was very important for people like Rosenthal and Topping, who appreciated the responsibility of being a senior editor and managing the staff appropriately so that they get the right people at the right place at the right seniority level, but also with enough perspective to be able to talk to all of their readers, and also at the same time keep from starting a world war.
I'm glad you brought up Abe Rosenthal and that policy about reporters going overseas before 30. I was going to ask you about that, but since you already mentioned it, I'm curious, now that you look back and reflect, which camp, do you fall in? Do you think he was right, or would you have gone over earlier?
I would have liked to have gone over early. I think I would have probably had more. I don't know. I think I would have been able to do more. And look, you begin to slow down after 30. I discovered that after the age of 30, you do begin to slow down. Not so much your legs and so on, but your way of thinking about the world. Your perspectives begin to narrow and to focus, and you begin to lose your ability to really see something as being really new and exciting. And the longer you go into your 30s and then 40s, the more that's the case. By the time I got to CBS in the end of 1980. I was 36 then, and I had, by the time I got overseas, I was almost 37. I stayed over there for 7 years, but that was good. I mean, it was good that I had that kind of gravitas, because when you're dealing with someone on camera, on television, and you're dealing with someone like, look, I interviewed Gaddafi twice, when he was running Libya. I interviewed several of the leaders of the Soviet Union. I interviewed a number of senior officials on camera, and I think they respect someone who was someone more serious, should we say, someone who looks the part. So I guess to that extent, it's probably better to have waited a little while. But look, I think I could have done more. I think my talents would have been better used overseas than they were covering, land issues on the east end of Long Island, or bickering between the Republican and Democrats in the state Senate in Albany. It wasn't something that I was really trained for. Wasn't something I really loved and understood. I had languages. I had a view of the world, I think, that was broader than simply, the train ride to Albany every week, which is what we got to do.
On a related note, what were some of the obstacles that you faced as a young foreign correspondent, a new foreign correspondent? Did you feel like it took you a little bit of time to sort of find your way, find your bearings?
Well, my first taste of being a foreign correspondent was when I arrived in Southeast Asia. What happened was, I was all set to go I was en route to Saigon. It was December of 1974, and if you remember back in history, the United States was still very much in Vietnam in those days. I mean, there was there had been the peace conference that Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho had undertaken, and so there was a treaty between the two countries. They had Vietnam, North and South Vietnam were clearly divided, but there was still hostilities going on. So it was not, it was a war still, but it had quieted down, and it was beginning to look like it was going to become a sort of a North-South Korea situation in Vietnam, and that was what I was basically going over to cover. At any rate, I get to Paris on my way over, and I was going to spend a few days in Paris talking to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong delegations in Paris, which was the only time I would have had a chance to really talk to the enemy, if you will. So I did that. I saw a few people from Le Monde and some other places that were very well plugged in Southeast Asia. I was about to leave for to get the plane to go to Saigon, and I get a telex from, I don't know if you know what a telex is, but it's like a typewriter message that comes through, a teletype from New York. And that's how they communicated with us in those days. We didn't have Wi-Fi, we didn't have cell phones, whatever. It was a telex. So I got a telex from the foreign editor, Jim Greenfield, who was Topping's successor. And he said, listen, he said, stop off in Phnom Penh on the way out there in Cambodia and meet up with Sidney Schanberg. Because you may have to spell him every now and then. He's our guy in Phnom Penh. Now in Cambodia, there was a real war going on. There was no question about that. So I said, okay. So Schanberg sends me a note. He says, listen, he said, bring as much tinned food as you possibly can. We may be eating off of that pretty soon. So I said, oh, okay. So I went out and bought a huge suitcase, filled it up, went to Fauchon, filled it up with any amount of tinned food I could find. But I mean, also threw in some foie gras and some, things like the caviar or whatever. I get out to the airport, and I could barely budge the suitcase. It was so heavy. I put it on the scale. In those days, they had those scales that you had a big thing that went around. It went around and pinned the needle at the top end of the scale. The ground hostess said, I've never seen it do that before. Anyway, I said, whatever it costs, put it on my air travel card. So we put it on the credit card, and off I went. I get to Phnom Penh, and Schanberg meets me. And the plane does this sort of falling leaf pattern to try and avoid artillery fire that was coming in. Sort of a circular run down, and then it taxis between these three walls of sandbags that were about twice as high as I was, and stopped, and off I came. And Schanberg sitting at the bottom of the stairs. He's standing there, and I look up at the terminal, and it was an all glass terminal with windows all over the front. There was not a single window in the terminal. It had all been blown out. All the windows had been blown out by glass. And he says, what are you standing there for? Run for it. They're shelling the airport. So I ran for it. We jump in the car and we go barreling down the road in towards Phnom Penh. And we're on the wrong side of the road. And I said, why are we on the left side of the road? And he said, because the right side of the road, they have the range for that. And so we're just outside of its artillery range if we stay on the left side of the road. That was really reassuring. So that was my introduction to being a foreign correspondent, and things went downhill from there.
That's a great story. That is a great story. It's funny. I've read a couple of memoirs from other foreign correspondents. We've had a couple on to talk to us at the chapter the way that you're doing, and
Sure.
One thing I always like to ask about is that a lot of them talk about this sort of camaraderie, or like it's kind of a clique, it's a cohort.
Still.
Other journalists get some of it, but really not all of it. Did you feel that way throughout your career?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, you're all in it together, as it were. We all stayed in the same hotel, the Hotel Phnom, which is still now a luxury, Relais Chateau hotel in, believe it or not, in Cambodia. We had these huge rooms. I mean, each room was fabulous. I mean, it had big circular fans over. None of them had windows because they'd all been blown out by shocks from incoming artillery. But we were all in it together, and so there was only electricity, like 1 or 2 evenings a week. The rest of the time, we wrote our stories on typewriters by by kerosene lanterns. But I mean, there was one time I got really, really sick, and Schanberg wasn't to be found. So Dave Greenway, HDS Greenway, who actually wound up working for the Boston Globe for many years as a columnist. Greenway said, there's a French doctor I know, French military doctor, right across the way. I'll get you over to see him. So we went over together. I mean, he was my competitor, the Washington Post, right? I was New York Times. We go over together, and the doctor says, he said, I don't know what you got. He says, but take 4 of these tonight. And when you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll either be dead or you'll be better. I was better. But no, I mean, I still have friends from those days. Probably my best friend in the world was the Le Monde correspondent, Patrice de Beer. And Patrice and I became lifelong friends. I see him every time we're in Paris. We, email all the time. Brigitte, his wife, has become a great friend of my wife. So we all stick together. We're all in it together, and there's no doubt about that. It is a fraternity of sorts.
I want to also ask sort of a couple more broad questions here. But, in the span of your career, you've had a lot of different positions. You've been a reporter, you've been an editor, news director, assistant news director, anchor, you've been on screen, off screen, in print, on digital. So in terms of being an editor and a reporter, when was the first time that you made that switch, and how did that go for you? I've talked to a lot of reporters who say that they've done it reluctantly.
I think every reporter does it reluctantly, but eventually you reach the position where you're not going to be a very good reporter if you can't get around as fast as other people can. And also, I think it's a way of in a way, it's kind of a way of giving back. We can pass on the knowledge that we have to younger people, the next generation, as it were. We can make sure the standards of journalism that we grew up with are being upheld, and I think that's very important. When did I actually make that transition? I guess it must have been when I went to Bloomberg from CNBC. I'd never really been an editor before that, but at Bloomberg, I was an editor. I ran the Money Group, it was called, the Money Team, which was the team that reported on the companies that banking, finance, and that sort of thing, like Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and so on. And I had reporters who did that, and I edited their stories. I had to sign their stories. So it was a transition. I mean, there was no doubt about that. Some other of my colleagues had been editors most of their lives, and that was probably easier for them. But you learn pretty quickly in the middle of a cauldron like that. So yeah, I learned, but I went back and forth. After that, I began writing again, I never stopped writing. So I've written 5 books, or I've translated 1 book, written 4 others, and I love to write. I write every day now. I mean, my Substack page is entirely my creation. Andelman Unleashed. Everybody should subscribe to it. It's free, at least for the moment, 100%. And you'll see some of my parts of my memoirs I'm putting on it. I write every day, some part of every day. And I don't think I could get through life if I didn't write at some part of every day, doing something like that, because it's in my blood. I'm not retired, and I never probably will retire. So here we are.
Yeah, I mean, not with a career like that. You don't just give that up super easily. I'm glad that you plugged your Substack, and you mentioned you're putting memoir excerpts on there. I was going to ask you that too, because I was noticing that of your 5 books, none of them really are that. And I know a lot of foreign correspondents did choose to sort of write a memoir, or just generally about their experiences. So I was going to ask if that was something that you were eventually thinking about doing. Sounds like maybe the answer is yes.
Not only thinking about doing, am doing.
Yeah, there you go.
I also have the title, and I will tell you how the title came about. So when I began taking Vietnamese, my Vietnamese tutor, the young fellow, very, very smart, he says to me, "So, Mr. Andelman, you are going to Saigon?" I said, "That's right. I am going to teach you one phrase that will be very important for you." He looks at me, he says, "Dang bang toi like disami." What's that? He said, "Don't shoot, I'm an American reporter." And that is the title of my autobiography, my memoir. "Don't shoot, I'm an American reporter." I said to him, "Actually, you're probably better off you taught me how to say, 'Don't shoot, I'm a Canadian reporter,' but that wouldn't be really accurate, but might more than anything else might have saved my life." At any rate, I have about somewhere around 850 manuscript pages written. I began at the beginning, and I'm just finishing up my New York Times stint, and I'm only 800 and some odd pages in. So it's going to be large. My agent said to me, you know, he said, she said, if you ever want to publish this thing, you're probably going to have to pare it down. I said, well, I'm really writing it for my son and my grandson, but you know, I think I'm going to start putting some of it on Substack. And I put one item the other day on that really resonated. I got more comments than that on anything else I've written lately. It was my time when I covered the March on Washington in 1963. I was with WHRB then, and I had gone down to do a documentary that summer on the March on Washington for the Harvard radio station, and my adventures for that. And you can read it on the website; it's free, and it's I think it's pretty compelling. But it will give you the idea of the kind of style that I'm looking for, taking the events of my life and putting them in some kind of historical context, and trying to help people understand what the shape of the world was that my exploits were traveling through.
That's great. I can't wait to read it once it's, you know.
Yeah, there'll be more. There's a
Yeah,
lot
there
more,
we go. You brought back Harvard, and we did have a question. You did mention before that you attended Harvard in the 60s, and legend has it you took Government 101 with a professor named Henry Kissinger.
Yes, indeed.
What did you learn from him, and did it help your reporting later as you were covering governments around the world?
Yes and yes. It really helped me a lot, I think. You know, Kissinger has had a bad rap in a lot of circles, and I can understand that some people may see some of the things he's done. And he made mistakes along the way, and I think he would concede that he made mistakes. But what was fascinating in those days was to look at he had a worldview, he had a concept. He called it Weltanschauung, which means worldview. And he said, you know, the greatest leaders, the greatest presidents, especially in the United States, are the ones that have had a worldview, have had a sense going into their administration, what they would like to see the world look like when they left. And to basically that all of their actions, or most of their actions that they take, no matter what crises come along, are designed to put the United States in a position where it can achieve that Weltanschauung that they've set up for themselves. And there aren't very many presidents who felt that way. And most of the time, when they don't have that, they just ping pong from crisis to crisis, back and forth, with no sense of where they're going, just reacting to what's happening that particular day. And if you take that test, if you use that test, and you use it with almost any world leader that you look at, or any country that you're covering, you really have a very good sense of what history is like, and what you're covering is like. I think that having that kind of a grounding really helps one become a better journalist. So studying government, studying languages, studying history, especially history, I think is very important. I mean, most of my books have looked at the world today through the prism of history. So my book, A Shattered Peace, Versailles 1919 and the Price We Pay Today, that looked at the mistakes that were made back at the time of the Versailles Conference that have changed our world today. And you know, Wilson happened to be one of the few presidents I really do think had a worldview. What he didn't understand was how to execute it, and how to basically achieve that kind of a worldview. And he really didn't have any advisors who were in a position to make that happen. So he had an unfortunate presidency. But I think his success abroad, overseas, was much better, much more than his success at home. At home, he was a catastrophe. I mean, there was no doubt about it. He was a catastrophic president. But abroad, he made some real impact on the world. I mean, he really set up he tried to set up a universe, that a universal construct that would work to prevent future wars. Unfortunately, he was undercut, A, because the United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles, and B, because he was never really able to withstand the onslaughts of people like Clemenceau in France, and Lloyd George, and the Prime Minister of Britain, who really had their own peculiar and particular domestic constraints that they were operating under, of having to basically exact the last pound of flesh out of the Germans. At any rate, I like to, my Red Line in the Sand, my most recent book, also looks at the evolution of red lines and their use in the past. Not so much by the term red line, because that was really only coined fairly recently, but the concept of lines that are defensible or indefensible, either geographic or diplomatic or militarily, and how those have worked today. And the book has had some resonance. In fact, I just got the final page proofs for the Arabic edition. It should be coming out either the end of this year or sometime in January. And they're the publishers over there are very excited about it. I wrote an afterword for it to put it, kind of to bring it more up to date. And they're running that too. They've just translated that. So it was that I think is a long way around that question about Kissinger, but I think Kissinger does give you on that kind of a perspective. Did he make mistakes? Yes. But you have to remember also that since Kissinger, there has never been a united war waged against Israel by a united group of Arabic countries in the Middle East. That was one of his great successes. His other great success, I think, frankly, was, I'm not sure he understood at the time this is what was going to happen, but it did. Vietnam has become a powerhouse in Southeast Asia and an antidote, if you will, or a balance against China, a resurgent China. And it's a country where, there's a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial spirit there, and will become a great ally, I think, of the United States and partner of the United States. So, you can fault him for some things, but I don't think you can fault him for that.
It's interesting what you said about kind of having a worldview and making decisions that, lead you toward that. I feel like that kind of is applicable also on an individual level as well. Like, it can be sort of a personal motivation too. I might sort of spin that on you and ask, if you came into this career with a worldview that changed significantly as you continued your work, and on the flip side, maybe smaller than a worldview, but a view of the industry, because the industry has changed a lot as you've been in it. And as you said, you're not retired, so you're still here navigating it with the rest of us. And I'm curious to kind of hear your reflection on how it's changed since you've been.
That's right. People say, "Oh, you've got a great career." I say, "Yes, but I'm not dead yet. It's not over." Look, I'll tell you one thing about journalism. All right, I think that if you can tell a good story, a great story, accurately, compellingly, in a fashion that will really move people, make them understand what's going on, I think that you can do that on any conceivable medium. When I was at journalism school, they were in the process of trying to purchase these huge machines that they thought were going to eventually deliver newspapers into individual people's homes, so you wouldn't have to have it land on your doorstep. They were kind of like huge fax machines, and that was what was going to be the future of journalism, was fax delivered newspapers, which was kind of insane when you think back about it. But in those days, it made perfect sense. You wouldn't have to have trucks going all over the place, carrying all these heavy newsprint newspapers or whatever, and you could choose whatever you wanted to have come into your home. Maybe you didn't want the sports section, maybe you didn't want the comics or what have you, right? At any rate, that obviously never happened. But the point is, if you can tell a really compelling story and tell it accurately and with impact, I think that's more important a skill than almost anything else. You can learn everything else. I mean, I learned how to do network television from the best network television people around. I mean, people forget about CBS. CBS, in the days I joined CBS, it was the transition between the Cronkite era and the Dan Rather era, and it was the platinum network. We had the best producers, we had the best camera crews, we had the best editors, everything. So that's where I learned how to be a journalist from a television perspective. But CBS hired me, because I had the French language. They wanted to send me to Paris, but they knew I was a good reporter. I was a stickler for accuracy. I knew how to tell a good story to make it understandable and make it something that people could really embrace and in many respects would move them. Not every time, but enough times. And also to what to look for in terms of what is news, what is newsworthy about the particular event or a particular story. All of those are very important elements. And I think that if you can do that, you can work in any medium at all. So I think that's very important. I don't know if that was what you were trying to get at in your question, but
No, I think that's useful advice, you know,
Mhm.
in any regard.
Sure.
Kind of on a related note, as we've mentioned, you reported from 86 different countries.
I think we might be up to 89 because we just
89.
no, well, my wife and I were in my wife and I were in Cyprus. Well, we were in Greece. I'd been to before. Pam had never been there. This summer we went to Greece, and then we went to Cyprus. In Cyprus, I added can add three countries in Cyprus. There's Northern Cyprus, which is Turkish Cyprus. There's Cyprus, which is the Greek portion, the southern half, and there is a small portion that is kind of like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. It's still the British military region of Cyprus. That's considered a separate country. So we drove through all three of those. So I added three more countries.
All right, well, we'll call it 86
Okay.
then.
All right.
The question I like to ask people who are widely traveled is not which place was your favorite, but which place surprised you the most or strayed the farthest from your expectations.
Wow, that's tough. I mean, obviously, most of Europe has not. I've basically been to every country in Europe except one, Liechtenstein, and we are going there in October. So that will complete Europe for me. Okay. Nothing really surprising in Europe, and I've been there through all kinds of changes of systems of communism in Eastern Europe and really extreme right-wing governments in Western Europe, all kinds of governments and leadership and so on. I would say the places that really surprised me most. Well, one was Bhutan. I found that extraordinary. Well, we went there a while ago. I was finished in Southeast. It was the one country in Southeast Asia I'd never reported on for the Times because it was never really easy to go there. But we decided to just go there, and we met everybody from the prime minister on down. Very interesting place. And the other was Mongolia. And Mongolia was fascinating. Has always been fascinating to me. In fact, when I was in college, I actually took a semester of the Mongolian language called Khalkha. I did pretty well in it, actually. Most all of the other students in the class were all graduate students in East Asian languages and literature, and they spoke Khalkha, they spoke the Mongolian with the old written alphabet, the runic alphabet. So Mongolian, when it was basically taken over by the Soviet Union, they imposed the Russian alphabet, and the only textbook for the new written alphabet was in Russian, which I could read. And the other students in the class, none of them could read it. By the time they learned enough Russian to read the textbook, they left me in the lurch. But so I was doing pretty well in Khalkha, and I was fascinated by it. I finally got to go there, and we traveled all through there, through Ulaanbaatar, the capital, that went down the Gobi Desert. I just found it was a country of enormous contrast, and to see how it managed to survive and thrive between two of the three world's great superpowers, China on the one side, and Russia or the Soviet Union on the other. It is really quite a remarkable tribute to these people. We took the train from we took the Trans-Mongolian Railway from Irkutsk in Siberia across Mongolia through Inner Mongolia to Beijing. And Inner Mongolia was really quite a contrast. I mean, it's the same people, but their whole vision and so on of the world is really completely different from the Mongolians, who really have a sense that they wanted to achieve a democracy. And we had gotten there just after the Soviet Union had dissolved. So they really had this vision of their country as a democracy and part of the, community of nations. And I found that fascinating and surprising. So I guess I would have to say those places.
That's interesting. I like that answer. And then so when you were sent to a new place on assignment, how did you prepare? Did you prepare a lot before you got there? And then what were some of your first steps when you did get there?
I had a system that it was easier to achieve when I was with the Times than it was was CBS. CBS, you tended to get parachuted into a place because they wanted a piece for the evening news that night. So, you get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's been a coup in Nigeria. You'd never been to Nigeria before. There's a charter waiting for you at Le Bourget. It's wheels up at 4:30 a.m. And they want something for the evening news that night. And the crew and the producer are meeting you at the airport. So that was like, you couldn't prepare for something like that. But when I was at the Times, you could prepare. And I read basically two things. There was a thing called, it was they're called area handbooks. And they were made for the Defense Department. I'm not so sure they still update them, but they were updating them through the entire time I was really reporting for the Times. For every country in the world, believe it or not, every country in the world where there was a defense attaché in the embassy, they had these handbooks, and they were printed. You could buy them from the government printing office for not very much money. I still have a whole collection of them, for basically every country I went to, and I would read those from cover to cover before I went. Then, if it was in a place like Eastern Europe, I covered basically 7 countries in Eastern Europe. So, and all of them were different. Each one had a different language and so on. I would read a lot of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty research material. And their research material was meticulous, and it was in great depth. The other research material was very useful, was the Economist Intelligence Unit. And I would get that, and I would read that. You had to be very careful about taking the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty material in with you, because I could never convince them to stop doing this, but they used to put their name, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, across every single page of their research material. So I'd have to sit there in the Belgrade Bureau before I went to some country, and I'd have to cut off the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty headline at the top of every page, the masthead. Let me tell you, that took a lot of time and effort, but I did. So, and it was worth it, because they really did have material that you couldn't find anywhere else. So those were the principal ways of doing it. This was, remember, before the internet, before anything kind of like major centralized research that was available. You were on your own. And so those kinds of things. There was also Radio Free Asia and some other places like that. There was some good research material in Asia. The Economist Intelligence Unit was very useful. So that's basically what I did.
That's good. You had a system. Seems like it was pretty reliable for pretty much everywhere you had to go.
Yeah, it was. And you got background, you got history at the same time. And because especially these area handbooks, they were for people who were going to be living there. So they gave you the society, they gave you the nature of the people, they gave you the derivation of the languages, they gave you what was, sports, what it was like to, what was really on people's minds there. All of that was in this one book, and so it was useful.
Yeah, that sounds, because I've heard that making sure you follow all the customs can be like a really important part of even just getting people to talk to you, like when you need,
Sure.
Sources abroad. Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit and ask, when did you feel comfortable starting to do analysis and commentary and opinion versus some of the hard news of your past?
Well, I think, I always did commentary. I always did some opinion. I mean, there's always a perspective that you have to have in your piece. When you're a good correspondent, you should really be able to give your reader a perspective of what it all means. The Times in those days was much more rigorous about it than I think it is today. But they used to have these things called news analysis, which were basically your assessment of what was happening in an area that you were located. And so I would write those. So that was where you could get more into opinion. I still feel uncomfortable really saying, this particular presidential candidate is good in France or whatever, and this person isn't. I don't like to do that. I like to still maintain a certain degree of not aloofness, but at least sense of being an observer rather than a participant. I guess that's the best way of putting it. And I think even a good commentator, a good columnist, really should not become a participant. I think they can, in fact, put a lot of their perspective into it. And I think a good news story of any kind has to have some degree of perspective, whether it's historical perspective or, philosophical perspective or what have you. there has to be a degree of that sort of concept of what is motivating people, why are they motivating people, how are they motivated, and what are the likely consequences of the events that you're writing about. And I think it may not be in every story, but it needs to be in the course of your career. It was interesting. I asked Topping before I went overseas for the first time, I said, what will be my sense that I have been a success as a foreign correspondent in Asia, in Eastern Europe, whatever? And he thought for a minute, and he said, you have to have the sense that if someone is reading your stories throughout the course of the year, it will be as though they were living there in that country during those times. And you have to think every time you write a story, your reader is sitting on your shoulder, looking through your eyes and hearing through your ears what is going on there. And that's the sense that you have to give them, as though they were there and experiencing everything you experienced, and giving a sense of what it means to the people on the ground there, and to them, and the importance of the people who are reading you back home. And if at the end of 2 years, 3 years, however long you were, in those days, the Times used to keep you overseas 2 or 3 years. They now sometimes keep people there for a lifetime, it seems, but mainly because it's too expensive to move people around the world that much anymore. But at any rate, whether it's 2 or 3 years or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years, the people reading your story should really have a good sense of what it's like to be living there with you. And I think that was always very important advice. It's something I paid close attention to.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you draw a distinction between perspective and commentary in opinion. So I just want to press you on that a little bit and see if maybe you can clarify.
Well, look, a columnist, I think, is someone who really does have a broader, who has a sort of a Weltanschauung, if you will, broader worldview, in a way. So, yeah. Oh, Adam has a very interesting question. We'll do that next, okay? I don't think there is a lot of difference between a good columnist and a good commentator and someone who's writing analyses. I think they all mesh into one. I mean, every now and then I'll see someone who I think, just as an example, there was a Washington Post correspondent who I happen to know very well, wrote a piece the other day saying it was about the American presidential election. He thought that Biden was too old. He shouldn't run. I would be uncomfortable doing that, writing that. And I mean, I think he's absolutely right, by the way. But I would be uncomfortable writing that with my name on it. I just don't think it's appropriate. He has such good perspectives, this fellow, on so many things around the world, that to say something like, to jump into the middle of a presidential contest like this with that kind of a comment, and it's been picked up widely, I must say. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't think it's appropriate, but people who are listening may have actually read it or heard about it. I don't think that's the right thing to do. But I think in the case of, for instance, in the case of, I mean, I personally happen to think Marine Le Pen in France would be catastrophic for the French people. But the French people, I think, kind of realize that too, because she's been trying for decades to become, she and her father before her, to become president. And they've never gotten more than about 35% of the vote max. And I do believe that 35% of the country in France do believe that she'd be good. But 65% of the country also believes they don't want to turn their country over to basically a fascist. Now, I wouldn't use that term in print, but that's what basically, there's not that much difference between her and some of the fascist leaders of France in the past. And the French people remember that. So you can kind of suggest that as the case, but without saying, I agree with them. You simply report on what is the general view of this person and what that could mean for the future of France or Europe, for that matter.
I see. Okay. We had a question. Are there any countries you haven't reported from or visited that you'd like to? I think you mentioned one, right? You're going
I'm going to Liechtenstein, right?
Okay. Yeah.
There are parts of Africa I haven't visited. I'd really love to visit. I'd love to visit East Africa. I've never actually visited South Africa, which I think is a huge gap in my knowledge. I was, however, Nelson Mandela's speechwriter during his first trip to the United States. When he first got out of jail, he came to the U.S. and traveled all the way across the U.S. I was recruited by one of his big American supporters, actually, Ted Sorensen, who had been John Kennedy's speechwriter, and who was then a lawyer at Paul Weiss. And I knew Ted. he asked me if I, would I take a leave of absence and become Mandela's speechwriters. Can't really turn that down. I found that was fascinating. And I had such an education in South Africa, and in so many fashions, so many levels of being with him for weeks, traveling across America. So, but I've still never been to his country, and I would love to do that.
Wow, that is really fascinating. That's going to make a really interesting chapter of your memoir.
Oh, yeah. In fact, especially when he wanted to meet Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson wanted to meet him. This is a very funny story. I'll tell you that. This will certainly be in my memoir. We were at the, we went to the not the Beverly Hills, but the Beverly Hilton. And Michael Jackson had taken a suite. And he was going to go in, and Mandela was going to meet him. And Michael Jackson insisted that there be nobody else in the room except him and Nelson Mandela. Now, Mandela had a not inconsiderable security detail and so on, and it was myself. I was his main liaison in the U.S. Nope, he didn't want anybody else in there. So, all right, went in there, and they spent close to an hour together talking. To this day, I have no idea what they talked about, and he never said, and neither did Michael Jackson. But I can assure you that the two of them spent an hour in that room, and they must have said something interesting, because Michael Jackson nor Mandela had tolerance for, just idle chit chat.
Wow. That's when you pull out your, cup and you're like listening at the.
What did I could have been able to do that?
Something that you kind of alluded to earlier, maybe looking forward a little bit now, but news outlets don't really fund foreign reporting the way that they once did. How concerned are you about this, and what impact do you think it has on how Americans see the rest of the world?
Oh, I'm very concerned about. I'm very concerned about the lack of a real deep core of foreign correspondence anymore around the world. It began when Larry Tisch bought CBS. I can put a date on when this actually happened. In April of 1987, Larry Tisch bought CBS News and decided he didn't need. Not only did he not need a Paris bureau anymore, he didn't need most foreign bureaus. So they closed bureaus in Bonn. In those days, it was Bonn and not Berlin. So Germany, they closed bureaus in Bonn, Rome, Paris, virtually every European bureau, except they kept one person in Moscow and one person in Tel Aviv, and that was it. And then one person in Tokyo and one person in. I'm not even sure they kept one person in Beijing in those days. And that was it. And that was the. Then when that happened, a whole lot of other networks began looking at that and saying, well, maybe we can get along without that also. So, in fact, it's funny because Larry Tisch came through Paris bureau. We had a long meeting with him, and he said, well, what would happen if we didn't get, the first day, we didn't get to an event like a hijacking or whatever. And, and we took a plane and we got there the second day. And I remember Joe Mazraf, who was this great cameraman for CBS. He looked at him and said, what happens if the first day they throw two American bodies out of the plane onto the tarmac and no one's there to shoot those pictures? Tisch didn't have an answer to that. But nevertheless, it was the last time we were really able to charter in on the first day of a, rent a charter and fly in on our own. All of that really began to affect them. I mean, that was the end of CBS as the Platinum Network. It was the end of a lot of events where you had, a huge army of reporters there, all reporting from their own perspective about a major event, so that you could really triangulate, if you will, off of what was really happening. Nowadays, and not only that, you knew that if you were getting reports from the Washington Post and the New York Times and CBS, ABC, NBC, these were staffers who really these were people with gravitas experience who had done this before, who were going to get a story that you could really count on. And I'm not sure that you necessarily can do that anymore. I think a lot more, shall we say, burden has been put on the consumer of news to make sure that they are getting news that can be trusted, from people that they can trust and rely on. Because so much news these days looks the same on the internet as it does any other particular news. And so people can be easily misled by, false prophets, if you will, who really don't understand what was going on or have their own agenda. And the last thing I can stand is reporters or commentators with an agenda.
We're getting close to the end of the time here, so I think I will ask you to end with a two-part question. The first part, it sounds like you've had a lot of really great mentors over the course of your career. So first of all, what is the best piece of advice you've ever gotten? And then what is one piece of advice you have for journalists today?
Oh, best advice I ever got. Well, I think I've really basically talked about it. That is to make sure that you report the news without fear or favor, regardless of any party, sector, interest involved. That was the New York Times slogan for many years. And it was actually up on the top year of the New York Times when it was printed. All the news is fit to print. But I think that's very important to understand that should be a journalist mantra, if you will. What I would suggest, look, here's the situation. If you want to be and this I think is important, I think there's always been two ways of becoming a foreign correspondent. You either work your way up through, the Woonsocket paper, to the, maybe then to the Hartford Courant, into the Boston Globe, and then maybe to the New York Times, or to a place but never take your eye off where you want to end up. I always knew I really wanted to end up overseas. So even when I was working for, a little CBS station in Sacramento, California, I knew that I wanted to be overseas someday. And when I was covering school board elections on Long Island, I knew that, I wanted to be overseas someday. So never lose track of where you actually eventually want to be. I think that's very important. And so that's one route of going overseas, is working your way up through the hierarchy here. The other way is to just go somewhere and begin reporting for someone. And, and hope that it's someplace that all of a sudden there will be a major event and you'll get noticed. And you will get noticed. The Times always used to have these files of people that they would keep a file on you. If you ever expressed any interest in going to work for them, they would have a file on you, and they'd watch some of the stuff, and stuff would go in there. You could send them stuff, and I think that's it's very important to either get noticed overseas in some place, and look, you can go to Paris and you can get hired maybe as a news assistant in the Paris bureau of the New York Times. But very few of those people ever make it onto the Times staff in Paris. But if you go to a place like, I don't know, like Benin or Gabon, and there's a coup there all of a sudden, and you are the one person there who speaks, African French and has contacts in the junta and that sort of a thing, you will suddenly be very much in demand, and your stuff will be read everywhere. So that's the other way of proceeding. It seems to me. So those are the two paths for getting overseas. Does that help at all?
Yeah. Option A, option B. Perfect. Okay. I think
we have some more questions. Let's see. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, Adam. We'll go a little over.
Oh, Lou Simons. Yes, Lou and I were colleagues and competitors, and my wife at the time knew his wife, Carol Simons, very well.
This was an anecdote shared with our chapter president, Adam. It said, Andelman and I know each other, but only for about 50 years. One oddity I recall is that back when we both were covering the final days of the war in Cambodia and afterward Thailand, he wore suit and tie when all the other hacks were sweating in short sleeves. I guess that's what distinguished ordinary correspondents from the gentleman of the New York Times.
Bien sûr, of course. I'll tell you a funny story about my dad. My dad was a lawyer in Boston, okay? He was a Boston lawyer. And my dad was also a Harvard Law graduate, okay? And he would go into court in Boston. It would be the middle of the summer. Of course, nothing was air conditioned in those days. Everybody was sweating like pigs, and everybody had taken their coat off. My dad always wore his three-piece suit and tie, very careful. Finally, one day, the judge turned to him and said, "Mr. Andelman, wouldn't you like to be more comfortable taking your jacket off?" And his client looked up and said, "No, Your Honor, he's a gentleman from Harvard."
There we go. Dress for the job you want, right?
It runs in the genes, I guess. So.
Oh, there it is.
I don't have a tie today though, but I do have my jacket with my little red thread, which indicates that I am a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, French Legion of Honor, which is the highest civilian decoration in France. So I'm very proud to wear that.
Let's get one more plug for your Substack before we end.
Oh, let me, if anybody, can anybody see my, my online, my chats? I can put the URL into it.
We can
Maybe.
add it to the video description.
Oh, okay, hold on.
Yeah. But
Let's see.
it's Andelman Unleashed,
There we are.
right?
Yep.
There we go.
I put the URL in the chat.
Okay, daandelman.substack.com. Perfect. All right.
Okay. Thank
Well,
you
thank
very
you
much.
so much
We
for
would love
joining
to have
us.
you all as readers of it. And there we are. I will spread the word widely as soon as you give me the YouTube.
Yes, we will get that to you as soon as
You
possible.
are a masterful interviewer, by the way. You have a
Thank
great
you.
future ahead of you in journalism.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we appreciate you joining us on behalf of the chapter. Thank you so much for your time.
And next week, we're going to be doing a Substack a training session, right?
Yes. Yes. I will coordinate with you on that, and we will send out some more information
Excellent. Okay.
coming soon. But yes, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everybody.
Take care. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.